My name is Buzz Aldrin. I was the lunar module pilot on Apollo 11 and one of the first men to walk on the moon's surface. Man has always been driven to explore his world and first use sailing ships to reach out to the distant horizon. That same quest for knowledge would ultimately take man beyond the Earth and towards the stars. Join me as we chart the first steps on mankind's greatest voyage, the exploration of space. When Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, and I realized that our mission would be the one to put men on the moon, we told ourselves it was just another flight. But the fact that Neil and I were to be the first men to walk on the moon would guarantee Apollo 11's place in the history of space exploration. This is the story of our journey.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
On July the 20th, 1969, this legendary transmission marked man's first landing on another planet. The Apollo 11 mission had successfully placed 2 men on the moon. This was the fulfillment of a pledge made by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 to send men to the moon and back within a decade. And when he visited Houston to open NASA's new Mission Control Center a year later, that pledge became a challenge to the American nation and the 400,000 people who worked tirelessly on the space program to make the dream come true.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept.
The 3-man crew of Apollo 11 all had space flight experience. Neil Armstrong, the commander, like many NASA astronauts, was a former Navy pilot. He'd flown Grumman Panther jets in combat during the Korean War before becoming a test pilot, and he flew to the edge of space in his X-15 rocket plane at speeds of up to 4,000 miles per hour. His previous spaceflight had been as the commander of Gemini 8, a mission which saw the first successful docking of 2 vehicles in orbit. The lunar module pilot on Apollo 11 was Buzz Aldrin. Like Armstrong, he also fought in the Korean War, shooting down 2 MiG-15s from his F-86 Sabre. In later years, Aldrin gained a PhD studying orbital rendezvous techniques at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. This was to prove vital during his mission on Gemini 12, where Aldrin and James Lovell would practice orbital rendezvous with another craft, developing the technique that would be critical for later Apollo missions. Aldrin also set a new record with a 5-hour spacewalk, or EVA. The 3rd crew member was the command module pilot Michael Collins, the man who would fly to the moon but not actually land on it. Prior to joining NASA, Collins served as an Air Force fighter pilot and an experimental test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Before joining NASA, he had logged over 4,200 hours of flying time. In 1966, he was the pilot on the 3-day Gemini 10 mission, during which he set a world altitude record and became the nation's 3rd spacewalker. The early years of the Apollo program were overshadowed by tragedy. On January the 27th, 1967, astronauts Walter Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were running a test countdown program. Perched high above the Kennedy Space Center on a Saturn rocket, they were sealed in the Apollo 1 command module when a flash fire erupted. Aided by the oxygen-rich atmosphere, the fire spread rapidly, creating a build-up of pressure which caused the exit hatch to jam. All 3 men died. The legacy of this tragedy was a complete redesign of the capsule and a 15-month delay to the program. But the Apollo program did continue. The early missions were unmanned flights designed to test the Apollo systems. These were followed by the manned missions, with each flight a rehearsal in greater detail for the first lunar landing. And of course, throughout this time, as Buzz Aldrin remembers, the Apollo astronauts were lobbying hard to be the crew to make that first historic flight.
You're dealing with a very, very competitive group of people, especially Navy carrier pilots who were test pilots. They wanted to get everything they possibly could. And you would advance your arguments or your positions, which was an appropriate thing to do.
By January 1969, the wait was over.
It was about the middle of January when it was announced that the Apollo 11 crew would consist of Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. And that if the next 2 missions were successful, we would be scheduled to land on the moon. So as soon as it was released in January, we started training on the optimistic note that the next 2 missions would be successful and we'd be scheduled for a landing. We could always back off of that and do a dress rehearsal or do whatever we would need to do to make up for some shortcomings that might have happened during those 2 missions. But we were very, very interested in their success.
The Apollo spacecraft were the heaviest yet to be launched into space. Getting them into orbit required enormous power, and that power came from the Saturn V rocket. At their factories around the United States, Boeing, North American, and McDonnell Douglas built the 3 stages of Saturn V. They were then flown or shipped to Florida, where they were assembled in the 52-story vehicle assembly building at the Kennedy Space Center. Stage 1 was designed to thrust Apollo to an altitude of 40 miles and a speed of 6,000 miles an hour. Then the second stage took over, pushing the spacecraft into orbit with 1 million pounds of thrust. Finally, Stage 3, capable of shutting down and reigniting, remained attached to the payload in orbit, where it was used to launch the manned capsule into deep space. When assembled or stacked, these 3 stages were 360 feet high, some 60 feet higher than the Statue of Liberty. These towering monsters were driven the 3.5 miles to the launch pad on giant tracked crawlers that traveled at less than 1 mile an hour. It took them 5 hours to deliver their mighty payload to the Apollo launch complex at Pad 39A. Here, the Saturn V would be positioned on the launch pad, supported only by the launch tower with its finger-like access gantries reaching out to the rocket. Prior to fueling, Saturn's liquid oxygen tanks had to be fantastically clean, as there was a real fear that even the grease from a workman's fingerprint could be sufficient to cause a fuel tank to explode. Then, 8.5 hours before liftoff, the Saturn's tanks would be filled with 500,000 gallons of liquid oxygen ready for launch. These were the final preparations underway on July the 15th, prior to the launch of Apollo 11. But how were the crew spending those final 24 hours?
We made a landing simulation in the trainer, and I think we just checked equipment that was going to be stowed, and then looked at the checklist, any of the last-minute little changes, and had a good rest, sort of. You know, you're going to get up the next morning and get in that rocket and go to the moon. You got a few things going on in your mind when you're trying to sleep the night before.
So, at dawn on July the 16th, the Apollo astronauts chosen to go to the moon made their way out to the launch pad.
Some of us were a bit more fortunate than some of the others. We were just in the right place at the right time.
Carrying the mobile air conditioning units that cooled their suits, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins rode the lift up to the White Room, the loading area immediately outside the command module. Buzz Aldrin, who was the last astronaut to go aboard, had to wait on a lower gantry, and so he had time to take in the scene below.
The sun was just beginning to come up. I could look out and see the waves coming in. I could see the evidence of a lot of people who were out looking at the spacecraft even that early. That was probably, maybe 7 o'clock in the morning. And we were due to lift off at 9:36, I think it was. It gave me a moment or two by myself to look at that rocket with the frost along the edges of the hydrogen tanks, very cold hydrogen tanks, and to think that, we were on our way in a couple of hours.
Nearly 1 million people had traveled to Cape Kennedy to witness the launch. Alongside them, 3,500 journalists from the international media had also assembled, reporting this historic event to an expectant world. Finally, at 9:36 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the countdown commenced. America's attempt to put a man on the moon had begun. But would it be successful?
T-minus 20 seconds, T-minus 20 seconds and counting. 17, guidance release, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started.
We were amazed at the smoothness of the liftoff. We could see by the instruments and hear the countdown that we had reached 0 and we were on our way, but you couldn't really feel it. And it was very smooth. It was so smooth that we all noted that afterward that we felt we could feel a slight swaying back and forth because of the guidance of the engines, which are not moving much at all, but they could give a little bit of movement.
Once in Earth orbit, the operations needed to place the command and lunar modules on course for the moon proceeded smoothly, one by one.
There are 4 big panels that held the command module in place, and then underneath that was the 3rd stage of the rocket. So that had to stay in place, everything together, for the maneuver leaving Earth orbit. Then we would, as coasting toward the moon, away from the Earth, then we'd separate and go out, turn around, come back, and the 4 panels would go in different directions, and we'd dock with the top of the lunar module, then separate it. So we'd be the 2 spacecraft docked together, heading for the moon.
With the lunar module and the command module redocked, the 240,000-mile journey to the moon began. The Apollo 11 crew now had 3 days to wait before lunar orbit. How did they keep themselves fresh, knowing the biggest test was still ahead?
It's anticipation, and how could it be boring? You know, you got wonderful sights, and you're reporting on things and checking on. As we were traveling to the moon, I went into the landing craft through the tunnel and made a lot of sort of pre-flight checks on a lot of the switches and preparing it for a day later when we would be in lunar orbit, and then the two of us would go in with our suits on and get it all ready for landing.
The Apollo 11 crew also appeared on live TV. For the watching audience back on Earth, this was a unique and thrilling event, made even more real for being shown in color, a recent innovation. However, the astronauts were reluctant TV stars.
We're not professional photographers and we're not professional actors, and we feel a little self-conscious playing those roles. We did that because we felt we needed to show people. We practiced taking pictures, and the settings were pretty standard. You didn't have to use a light meter. You just don't point the camera at the sun, and you try and point it down sun. And most of the pictures come out very well.
Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins had not seen the moon on the voyage out, but now, braking to enter lunar orbit, it loomed large in their cabin window. It was time to prepare for descent. Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, or LEM, leaving their colleague, Michael Collins, alone in the command module. From now on, Collins could do very little to influence events. Then at 4 days, 3 hours and 46 minutes mission elapsed time, the LEM, now called Eagle, and the command module, Columbia, undocked. The next critical stage of the mission had begun. Aboard the Eagle, Armstrong and Aldrin found themselves in cramped quarters. It was strictly standing room only.
We were hooked in with cables attached, pulling us down to the floor, so that we were ready to undock, and then we extended the landing gear, and Mike Collins inspected that, and then we made a slight maneuver of separation as we got into position to make a major maneuver on the backside of the moon, which, when we got to the front side, brought us down from 60 miles down to about 10 nautical miles. And that was the point downstream or upstream from the landing site where we would start the 11-minute powered descent.
Back on Earth, mission controller Gene Kranz was preparing his team at Houston for the most demanding day they'd ever faced.
As we were approaching the time to start the descent to the moon, I gave my controllers a few-minute break to go out and relax a bit, go to the restroom, maybe grab a cup of coffee. And then when they came back into the control room, you lock the doors. And when you lock these doors, there are only 3 outcomes that day. You're either going to land on the moon, you're going to crash, or you're going to abort the mission. Those were the only 3 outcomes available to myself and a very young team I had. So I felt I had to give them a few words. I had to tell them what I was feeling, because I know their guts must have been boiling inside. And this was a very private conversation. It was on a loop that only the controllers in this room here could hear. This sort of gave me the opportunity to say, I trust you, I love you, you're a great team, and I think we got the right stuff to put a man on the moon this day. And then I said, okay, gang, let's go do it.
And so the Eagle began its descent to the moon's surface.
Eagle, we got you now. It's looking good, over. Roger, copy. Eagle, Houston, after yaw around, angled, S-band pitch, -9er, yaw, +18. Roger, you're a go to continue power descent. You're a go to continue power descent.
5 minutes into the burn that would slow the LEM prior to landing, the computer sounded a 12:02 alarm. It was overloading at a critical moment. Aldrin asked Mission Control for advice.
Give us a reading on the 12:02 program alarm. Roger, we got you. We're going at alarm. Good radar data.
A quick-thinking controller in Houston assured Aldrin it was safe to override. The problem was unusual but not critical. Gene Kranz's prediction that his team had the right stuff was proving absolutely correct. The descent could continue.
1,400 feet, still looking very good. 700 feet, 21 down, 33 degrees. 100 feet, down at 19.
500 feet from the moon's surface, Neil Armstrong had to take partial control of the lunar module.
Yes, he was directing it through the autopilot to extend where we were going to go, because at 500 feet he could see that if it kept going, it was probably going to come pretty close to where there were a lot of boulders, and there was one crater that he wanted to avoid. And turns out the best way, the most prudent way to avoid something is to fly over on the other side rather than try and land short or left or right. But when you fly over the other side, that's the one choice that also consumes more fuel, because you're staying up longer, keeping the engine burning. And when we had 60 seconds of fuel left, when the light came on, we were still about 100 feet off the ground. And I was trying to give Neil a little body English, but I didn't want to disturb his train of thought. So when 30 seconds was called out by Houston, 30 seconds of fuel left, we were about 10 feet above the ground, and I could see that we were probably going to get down okay.
To the right a little. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Very smooth touchdown. Tranquility. Be advised, there are lots of smiling faces in this room and all over the world. Over.
And I can remember just briefly looking over at Neil and smiling and sort of patting him on the shoulder, and then we went about doing the rest of the things we needed to do. After landing, we had a period where we prepared the lander to leave at the next opportunity, which was 2 hours later. And it was during that time that we had the opportunity to have a brief meal. So I thought I would precede that with the serving of communion. It was a gesture that I felt was reasonably appropriate, considering my status at the time of being an elder in the Presbyterian Church.
But before going ahead with what was clearly a Christian ceremony, Aldrin checked with Deke Slayton back at NASA.
My views on spirituality have broadened considerably since then, and I think that Deke Slayton was correct. When I told him I wanted to tell the world what I was going to do, he said, no, don't do that. So that's when I modified it and just asked people who were listening in to give thanks in their own particular way.
It was time to open the hatch and step out onto the moon. Just who would have the privilege to make this walk into history had been hotly debated prior to the launch.
Maybe 2 months before the flight, it really had not been decided yet which one of the two crew members would get out first. There were reasons of workload and training that in previous spacewalks always had the commander, who had many more things to do in a flight, stay inside the spacecraft while the junior member did the spacewalk. The actual decision was not being made, and it was kind of a hot potato. So I suggested that maybe we get a decision made, and when it was correctly determined that the commander of the mission should be the one who would go out first.
Do you think you can open the hatch at this pressure, about 0.12 psi?
We're going to try it.
Roger.
Guided by Aldrin, Neil Armstrong eased himself out of the Eagle's tiny hatch, moving out onto a ledge called the porch, where he's caught by the color film camera on the Eagle.
The hatch is coming open.
But before he could descend, he had a vital task to perform. Back on Earth, some 600 million people were waiting to see him walk on the moon, live on TV. Armstrong had to activate the black and white camera that would send these pictures back to a world holding its breath.
And we're getting a picture on the TV.
Carefully, he descended the ladder, checking every movement. Because the Eagle hadn't sunk into the lunar surface as expected, there was a 3-foot gap from the bottom rung. Cautiously, Armstrong jumped down. Now he was standing on the Eagle's landing pads, just inches from the surface of the moon. Then he stepped off and onto another world.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Moving away from the ladder, Armstrong made his first halting steps. He and his ungainly suit weighed 348 pounds on Earth. Here, in the 1/6 gravity of the moon, the combined weight was just 58 pounds. Armstrong had the weight of a child. Armstrong needed to get a bulky stills camera down from the Eagle. To do this, he and Aldrin had to operate a kind of conveyor pulley system that required a lot of effort on their part to make work. As Mission Control urgently reminded him, Armstrong's first task was to collect a contingency sample of moon rock. Should they have to make a sudden departure, this was proof, if nothing else, that Apollo 11 had made it to the moon. Taking a collapsible handle with a detachable bag, he began digging in the moon's surface, exploring dust and rock that had lain undisturbed for millions of years. Everywhere was the same fine powder, but occasionally his probe met more resistance as he hit rocks. Anxious to please the geologists back on Earth, he scrambled some of the smaller rocks into his bag. Looking down at what he was collecting, he saw soil that was almost black, like powdered graphite. Now it was Aldrin's turn to leave the LEM. As he did so, he had one very important detail to remember.
We had been told when we were outside not to close the door all the way, but not to leave it open all the way. So they said partially close the hatch. So I made kind of a joke about it, being careful not to lock it. And in thinking about it afterward, if there was a leak inside and it started pumping oxygen in there, it would have closed that hatch and it would have been very, very difficult to get back in again.
Are you ready? All set. Now I want to back up and partially close the hatch. Making sure not to lock it on my way out. Particularly good thought. That's our home for the next couple hours. We want to take good care of it. Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Well, you could look out toward the horizon and distinctly see it curving away. It was not flat. It curved away, and there was no air to give any haze or any obstruction to vision. So you could see very clearly boulders that were right on the horizon that might be 3/4 of a mile away. The only color that was there was what we brought with us. And then if we looked almost straight up, 24 degrees from straight up, we could see the blue oceans of the Earth. And that was a little bit of color, and the spacecraft was. And it was just a natural, spontaneous putting two words together that were sort of contrasting that I thought was appropriate. Magnificent desolation as a phrase that described the event of being there, but the utter desolation of the surface of the moon itself.
Although it had been agreed internationally that no nation could claim the moon, NASA felt that since America had got there first, unfurling the stars and stripes would be an appropriate gesture. As Aldrin discovered, however, this turned out to be a tricky operation.
The pole itself, where it was going to go in the surface, was not sharpened in a way that would let it penetrate easily. And the dust had no molecules in between it, so it was very compact already, and you couldn't squeeze it together too much. And what was around the edge of the pole was loose, so it was not too secure.
One of Aldrin's tasks was to assess how easy it was to move around in 1/6 gravity, something he'd trained for back on Earth.
We trained for 1/6 gravity a little bit in the airplane, the KC-135, that would do a nose over and give 0 gravity where everyone would float around, or it could give 1/6 gravity. We did a little bit of underwater training, and the sum of all of this convinced us, really, beforehand, that it was going to be very easy to move around on the surface. But we felt we had to verify that once we got there. And then it occurred to me that if I had the time, that it would probably be a good thing to demonstrate that mobility in front of the TV camera. So it looked like I was kind of horsing around, but actually I was trying to stay in front of the camera and 1 foot in front of the other, and then 2 feet around and change direction.
You do have to be rather careful to keep track of where your center of mass is. Sometimes it takes about 2 or 3 paces to make sure that you've got your feet underneath you. And about 2 or 3 or maybe 4 easy paces can bring you to a fairly smooth stop. Like a football player, you just have to put out to the side and cut a little bit. So-called kangaroo hop does work, but it seems your forward stability is not quite as good.
Armstrong and Aldrin then found themselves at the end of the longest long-distance phone call ever.
Tranquility Base, this is Houston. Could we get both of you on the camera for a minute, please? Neil and Buzz, the President of the United States is in his office now and would like to say a few words to you. Over.
That would be an honor.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to Earth.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here representing not only the United States, but man of peace of all nations, and with interest and a curiosity and with a vision for the future. Honor for us to be able to participate here today.
As well as collecting rock samples, Armstrong and Aldrin set up a number of scientific experiments. These included deploying a solar-powered seismometer that would detect moonquakes and send the readings back to Earth, and a device to measure the solar wind. Finally, they deployed an array of prisms that would reflect a laser beam from Earth to help scientists measure the precise distance between the Earth and the Moon. Armstrong and Aldrin had been given a 10-minute extension to their extravehicular activity by Houston. But now that time was up. They had to prepare for the next, and in some ways, most critical stage of their mission, the ascent from the moon.
Buzz, this is Houston. You have approximately 3 minutes until you must commence your EVA termination activities. Over.
Roger, understand.
The two men now returned to the Eagle to rest and prepare the craft for lunar liftoff. As they reconnected their suits to the LEM, they felt the welcome rush of oxygen that meant they could jettison their backpacks. Ironically, the shock as their backpacks hit the moon's surface was detected by the seismometer they'd just erected. Armstrong joked, "You can't get away with anything these days." Kennedy's pledge had been to put a man on the moon and bring him back. That commitment was about to be tested as Armstrong and Aldrin, relying on just one small ascent engine, prepared to leave the moon and rendezvous with Columbia in lunar orbit. Throughout the moonwalk, Michael Collins had been listening to the historic radio signals as he kept a lonely vigil orbiting the moon in Columbia. With the Eagle about to lift off from the moon, he knew there was little he could do to help if there was a problem during the ascent. 50,000 feet was the lowest he could go if they needed rescuing. Any lower took him too close to the towering lunar mountain ranges. Looking back, he recalled his thoughts as he waited in isolation. My secret terror for the last 6 months has been leaving them on the moon and returning to Earth alone. If they fail or crash back to the moon's surface, I'm not going to commit suicide. I'm coming home, but I'll be a marked man for life. The same thought had occurred to the politicians back on Earth. Should the unthinkable happen, the plan was for President Richard Nixon to speak to the widows privately and then to read a specially prepared speech on network television. It began, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery, but they also know there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice." Back on the moon in the cramped cabin of the Eagle, neither man had any time for such thoughts. They worked calmly through their pre-flight checks. They were coming home.
6, 5, port stage, engine arm ascent, proceed. Channel, beautiful. 26, 36 feet per second up. 5 for the pitch over. Very smooth.
As the two spacecraft successfully rendezvoused in lunar orbit, it seemed, to the watching world at least, as if the most dangerous part of the mission was over. Did the astronauts themselves ever consider the possibility that their mission would fail?
Well, since our lives were on the mission, we had a tendency to maybe feel a little optimistic about our chances of getting back. And I think we really all felt that it was around 95, 96, 97% that we would make it back safely, and that was a reasonable chance. As far as mission success, a successful mission would be a successful landing, staying on the surface, not necessarily going outside, but lifting off and coming back. And we compared our choices or our thoughts of probability, and it was around 60% between the three of us.
The return to Earth went exactly as planned. On July the 24th, the Apollo crew saw a final sunrise over the Earth and then began their final descent through the Earth's atmosphere.
You're cleared for landing. Roger, gears down and locked. See you later.
Their trajectory had to be exact. If they were too steep, they would burn up. Too shallow, and they would skip off into orbit. They hit the atmosphere at 24,700 miles an hour, right on target. The heat shield worked perfectly, turning Apollo 11 into a comet streaking across the sky. Splashdown was 812 miles southwest of Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean, while a beaming President Nixon looked on from the deck of the recovery carrier, the USS Hornet. Immediately, the capsule was surrounded by Navy divers who threw biological isolation garments into its open hatch. NASA was so worried about moon germs, the crew had to clamber into these gray-colored suits even before they were winched up out of the water.
Well, it was important to some doomsday predictors who thought there might be germs on the moon, very virulent and very cause of great concern to people back here. That's why we were in quarantine, because if they were toxic in some way, we would come down with some symptoms, and they didn't want us walking around giving whatever it was to other people.
Now safely locked up in their quarantine trailer, the astronauts finally got to meet the president.
Neil, Buzz, and Mike, I want you to know that I think I'm the luckiest man in the world. And I say this not only because I have the honor to be President of the United States, but particularly because I have the privilege of speaking for so many and welcoming you back to Earth. As a result of what you've done, the world's never been closer together before. And we just thank you for that.
The three men were flown first to Hawaii and then home to Ellington Air Force Base in Texas, still in their quarantine trailer and only able to talk to their loved ones on the phone. In fact, it was 17 days before NASA considered them germ-free and released them from this strange and occasionally public isolation. Free from their quarantine, the Apollo 11 crew began a nationwide tour where they were welcomed like heroes by an adoring nation. But is that how they felt?
You feel like people are very respectful, and whatever is happening has made you a hero. So you gotta play the role, smile and wave.
The rocks and samples that Armstrong had so painstakingly collected on the moon were now analyzed by teams of scientists from around the world. They found them to be much older than expected, possibly up to 3 billion years old, and their chemical composition was radically different from anything found on Earth. Looking back now, how does Aldrin feel about his adventure?
A few of us had to be a part of the Apollo program, and then a few of those few to be able to have the opportunity to be the first human beings to actually set foot on the moon.
Neil Armstrong has rarely spoken about his flight to the moon, but he broke his silence when he attended a press conference on the 30th anniversary of his Apollo 11 flight.
The important achievement of Apollo was a demonstration that humanity is not forever chained to this planet, and our visions go rather further than that, and our opportunities are unlimited. The kids, I find, are pretty enthusiastic about what we did. The regret on our side is that they used to some years ago, they used to say, we were reading about you in science class, and then it was, we were reading about you in history class, and now I think it's early American history.
Since 1969, many myths and stories have sprung up around the Apollo 11 mission, and indeed the whole Apollo program. The most outlandish amongst these is the theory that it was all a hoax. They didn't go to the moon at all, and it was all faked in a giant TV studio. Hoax theorists claim several key pieces of evidence that prove NASA never went to the moon. One of these is that the flag was flapping in a breeze. In reality, the flagpole was still vibrating from being stuck in the ground, and the ripple is because the crossbar used to keep it horizontal wouldn't fully extend, leaving the stars and stripes with a permanent wave. The hoax theorists also claim that Buzz Aldrin, exiting the LEM, should have been in the LEM's shadow, yet he was brightly lit. They claim this was from extra lighting on the set. In reality, it was because the lunar surface reflected a lot of sunlight towards Aldrin. That reflected light is why we can see the moon from the Earth. NASA had fulfilled Kennedy's historic pledge, and America had grasped the opportunity to become a spacefaring nation that would put another 10 men onto the lunar surface. But the future of space exploration held new risks and new dangers. Political pressures and human tragedy would make the journey ahead even more difficult. Coming up in Space Conquest, the story of NASA's greatest tragedy. In 1986, school children across the world watched as NASA launched the rocket that would put a teacher into space. Just over a minute later, the external fuel tank exploded, killing everyone on board. We follow the story through the months leading up to the launch of that fateful 25th shuttle mission, and discover how bad management, weather, and politics contributed to the spectacular destruction of the Challenger space shuttle in the clear blue Florida skies.